I'm Kaylee Gonzalez, and this is my presentation for Week 10. In this presentation, I will be going over the 10th Amendment, express powers, implied powers, supremacy clause, elastic clause, as well as regulatory laws and the framework of separation of powers and how the Constitution is amended. Beginning with the 10th Amendment, it establishes that any power not explicitly given to the federal government or withheld from the states are reserved for those respective states or the people. And something that really interested me was from the Hip Hughes video that it gets muddied when looking at the flexible parts of the Constitution, such as the General Welfare Clause and the Elastic Clause. Up next, the express powers, which are the explicit powers that are specifically granted to the federal government by the U.S. Constitution. So like Congress can declare war, for example, or the president can act as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And from the textbook, what interested me was that the express powers are given to both Congress and the president, which I didn't know before. Next, we have implied powers, which are governmental powers not explicitly stated in the Constitution, but they're understood to be necessary to carry out those expressed powers. And this is derived from the Elastic Clause. And from the textbook, as mentioned, they stem from the Elastic Clause, and they are used to support the federal government when they play a role in controversial policy matters. Up next is the Supremacy Clause, and that establishes that the Constitution and the federal laws are the supreme law of the land. So something that interested me was, of course, again from the Hip Hughes video, it tells that the federal government reigns supreme over the states if it's necessary. So if like the federal law and the state law are in conflict with each other, the federal law will prevail. Next, we have the Elastic Clause, and this is the necessary and proper clause. It grants the Constitution the power to make laws necessary and proper for carrying out the explicitly listed powers. And something that interested me in the Hip Hughes video is if the federal government can rationalize what they're doing to execute a delegated power, then they can do things that aren't directly in the Constitution. So an example was the creation of the National Bank. Now for regulatory laws, how they are made is that it first begins with the agency, a government agency, determining that a new rule is needed. And these are developed based on the authority of Congress. Next, the agency drafts a proposed regulation in the Federal Register. Then the public has a period to provide feedback on the proposed rule. After the agency reviews the comments, they will issue a final rule. And this final rule then goes through more reviews and is eventually published before it takes effect. Once it is effective, the agency enforces the rule through licensing and adjudication. Next, for how regulatory laws are enforced, they are enforced through a combination of methods, inspections, investigations, and legal action. So if violations are found, they can impose penalties, require corrective actions, or pursue legal proceedings. Next, for how regulatory laws are adjudicated, they are adjudicated through either formal or informal proceedings. So formal adjudications are like a trial-like process with the hearing, and informal adjudications are, it's a broader category for the agency to make decisions like granting or revoking a permit. Now, for how regulatory agencies fit into the framework of the separation of powers, they do tend to pose a challenge because they combine legislative, executive, and judicial functions, which blurs the lines between the branches of government, but they aren't necessarily a bad thing because through them we do get like the FDA and OSHA, just to name a few. And moving forward, if the country would benefit with more or less regulatory agencies, it's hard to say because there are valid arguments coming from both sides. More agencies can protect consumers and address environmental or safety concerns, while less agencies could lead to economic growth and lower costs for businesses and consumers. So again, it's really hard to say, like, it's there are good arguments for both sides. Now, for how the Constitution is amended, the Constitution is amended through a process of 2/3 vote for both houses and 3/4 vote of all states. So, for the first example would be the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery and servitude across the United States, and its purpose was to formally and legally end the institution of slavery throughout the entire country. Second is the 19th Amendment, which prohibits states from denying a citizen's right to vote based off sex, so this effectively granted the women the right to vote. And this was a culmination of a lot of activism due to the women's suffrage movement. Lastly, we have the 22nd Amendment, which limits the U.S. president only 2 terms in office. And this was passed after President Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected to serve a 4th term after already serving during the Great Depression and World War II. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation.